folks, I'm going to speak here because this is where our virtual audience has sound. So I'm Stacy Holmes. I'm on the system administration team here in King County. I'm having my colleagues introduce themselves and our co-presenter from King County, and then have people in the room introduce themselves. For those of you who haven't been at one of our HMIS trainings before, we manage two audiences. So we have you in person, and we have a virtual audience who's seeing everything on the screen and hearing the room. We'll be doing lots of repeat of the questions so that they get those as well, and then we'll be repeating their questions out loud. So this is a way to try to provide as much access as possible for these trainings, and then we locate them around the county at different locations to, again, try to provide as much access as possible. So if Danielle, do you want to start introductions?
I'm Danielle Remedy. I work for Get Focus, and I'm gonna.
Sorry, I was just gonna speak up. Speak up.
And I'm gonna stand here and George you for a little while.
Thank you.
And I'm Sarah Doherty, and I lead the system administration team for Get Focus in King County.
And I'm Kate Speltz with King County Homeless Housing and Programs.
Aaron Abrahamson with Chief Seattle Club.
I'm Tanya Marceau with Chief Seattle Club. Sam Berkeley, I'm an intern at Seattle.
Robert Gibney, Congregations for the Homeless.
Easy Hour Program Coordinator.
Joe Elmos, Youth Care.
Robert Peterson with Salvation Army.
James Hanlon, Salvation Army.
Gabriel Pierce, Seattle.
Michael Quinn from Dodger.
Welcome. So I know that folks in our virtual audience can't hear everybody in the back of the room like that. We will be repeating questions when it's critical information. We have about, can you see how many people we have?
About 30.
We have about 30 signed on so far in our virtual audience. I know from looking at the registrations that they represent, 15 to 20 different agencies. If they all show up, we had about 60 who registered. We always have always have like 100 people that register, and half of you will be able to come because of work schedules. So, we ready to get started?
I think so.
Okay. Kay, do you want to be up here? There's a second chair here if you want to sit maybe on the other side, or close enough for folks to hear.
People usually don't have trouble hearing me, but I will.
All right, so we're going to start by talking a little bit about the history of ROIs and HMIS in King County, since we have kind of gone through a long path, a winding path to get where we are now, and it's helpful to know that history in order to understand why we find ourselves in the place that we do.
Can I ask a quick question first?
Yeah.
What do we mean when we say ROI in this context?
So ROI means release of information, and it is what clients sign to give permission to have their identifying information shared in HMIS. If they do not sign an ROI, then their information, the identifying pieces of their information would not be shared in HMIS. And we'll go over, of course, that process in more detail. So should I talk about the history, or do you want to talk about the?
So I can talk a little bit about the history. Some of you have been in this long and storied road along with me. Some of you are newer to our HMIS and ROI process. But some years back, we had an HMIS system that was known as Safe Harbors. And the way that system was constructed, each agency had its own relationship to the data system and would have its own ROIs in paper versions, in files. And if someone happened to be working with Chief Seattle Club would have the ROI in their file. And if at a later time or at the same time they were working with someone at Somali Youth and Family Club, they would also sign an ROI, and that would be in their paper file. So it was a very kind of siloed system that people might have multiple ROIs and multiple identities within the HMIS. There wasn't any uploading of information into the system, so someone may have already come in, they've told their story, all their information was in the system. but I didn't know that as a case manager because I was at a different agency, and then I would do it again, collect that same information again, put it in my file. So several years ago, we moved from that safe harbor system to Clarity Human Services, which is managed by BitFocus. It's our current HMIS system. And this system has much more kind of built-in transparency and the ability for someone to answer all those initial questions and sign the ROI and have the information there. So when an individual comes to agency number 2, they can just look up and say, okay, we have all that information. We don't need to have you go through it again. We can start at point C or D rather than starting at point 1. Do you want to talk, maybe move on and have you talk, Sarah, about the kind of the ROIs as we moved from one system to the next?
Sure. So it was decided when we were making the transition, in order to kind of, more easily facilitate the transition, that ROIs from safe harbors would be grandfathered into the new system, with the caveat that those ROIs are supposed to be uploaded into the new system, so that folks can see that there is actually an ROI for this client in our one central system that we can all look at. So there's no question about whether there's an ROI, but it was still okay to use the Safe Harbors ROIs because they last 7 years and in many cases, would still be valid for a client. So we didn't want to revisit the whole issue with clients and kind of disrupt services in that way. We wanted to make sure that there was a way to, to kind of keep things moving as smoothly as possible. But part of the changes were that, now there is, because we have a shared system, we do have one ROI for the whole system, which means that clients only need to sign once. So again, if they did sign Safe Harbors ROI and an agency had that on file and uploaded it into the system, then it would be taken care of for 7 years, and it wouldn't be necessary for clients to sign again, to have to go through the conversation with clients again. And if you look and can see that a client has an ROI, then you know that you don't have to broach that conversation with the clients. Anything else to say about?
In terms of background, I think.
Okay. So that brings us to where we are now, which is, getting those ROIs in the system. And so we want to go over the technical process for how to document consent or non-consent in HMIS in our current system. This may be a process that you're all familiar with, but we just want to go through it to make sure that everybody's clear and has that same baseline starting point, and so that you can ask any questions that you might have.
And before we move further into this technical piece, I guess one more thing to say is why the ROI and what the purpose of it is in the system. And that is if the person has signed the ROI and agreed to have their identified information shared, then the purpose of that is to use it to help people better access services and access housing. So the information is in there, and we can be working together collaboratively in the best interest of the person that we're serving.
Right. Because of course, being able to see the whole client's history is much more useful than just being able to know your own agency history. I think that that's actually been really eye-opening. I've heard a lot of comments from folks about having a shared system and kind of seeing that the client does have this whole service involvement outside of just what they have for your agency has been pretty interesting for folks to see.
And also can be helpful if you have a housing resource for someone, it helps you be able to find them if you can see that they're currently served somewhere else. Just slip out of the way.
Danielle's gonna switch into Danielle.
So I'm going to really quickly go through the actual, this is how you do the ROIs piece. So here, to upload an ROI, you find the privacy shield for the client, open it up, add a release of information. This is the training site. So in the live system, this will default to 7 years, and the training site, it only defaults to 2. And the start date will default to the date that you're entering it. So like if the release was signed 3 days previously, make sure that you update that start date. There's now 2 options for documentation. There's an electronic signature option and an attaching the PDF option. Attaching the PDF is the one that's been kind of around the longest. So when you select documentation attaching a PDF, it will give you the option of finding a file. Find the file you're looking for. It will tell you right here when it's been completed. add the record. And then it'll tell you here which type of consent it was. So if this was an electronic, it would say electronic here. If you want to view it or print it out, you can always open it back up. To add an electronic consent, you go through the same process. Click on the shield, add a release of information, permission, yes, dates, documentation, electronic signature. You can sign the e-document. Down at the bottom, there's a signature box. If you have like an iPad or something, the client can sign with their finger. If you're at your desktop, the client can click and drag with the mouse.
Just let me interrupt a second. So the documentation that's above is the actual release. So you can have clients read it on the screen right there and go through it. So they'll be seeing the same information that's on the paper.
Yeah. So once they sign, make sure you hit apply. Or if for some reason the signature didn't work, you can always reset it. Re-sign, hit apply, and then save. This will then tell you that the e-sign document is complete. Add the record, and it'll tell you here that the type is electronic signature. If the client wants a copy or you want a copy for your records, you can open it up here with this little icon. It'll show the signature, it'll have the date that it's signed and the client's name.
And how can you tell if your client does or doesn't have an ROI on file?
You can tell by opening their privacy shield and looking down here. Is there a second way to tell?
No, just
Okay.
that. But what does it look like if they don't have?
If they don't have an ROI on file, there will be here, it'll say no results to display.
And so with this electronic system, so no on file, that doesn't mean that Michael Quinn doesn't have one in his file folder at his desk. It may exist, but as far as the system knows, there isn't an ROI.
Our clients, they sign the ROI, but we keep it in file. Shouldn't we upload it to their?
Yes, the question was that clients are signing ROIs and whether they should be uploaded into Clarity, and the answer is yes. Definitely, you want to upload those so that everyone can see that the ROI has been signed. Yeah.
Couldn't we just have the clients, if they're there, just sign electronically instead of having to go through the process of uploading? Because it would be much quicker.
Absolutely. Yeah. The question is it fine? Couldn't we have clients just sign electronically right there rather than uploading? And the answer is definitely. That's why the functionality exists, to make it easier to get those signatures.
Although I would say if they've already signed them at another agency, you know your clientele, how traumatizing it may be or frustrating to go through it again when they know they already signed it. Take that into account and don't just for kind of technical ease have them go through and sign it again.
So we have them sign it before we even look there. Should we be uploading our signed copy, or if we see that there's already one in there, it's okay to download it?
The question is, if you have the client sign an ROI without first checking the system, should you go ahead and upload that ROI if they already have one? If they already have one, you don't need to upload the ROI. If they don't have one, then you can go ahead and upload the one that you've had to sign.
And I would add a statement before that, which is it's recommended that you check first, because then you don't have to go through that with the client. If you check first, you know there's one in there, then one less thing that you and the client have to do.
And the system itself will only let you have one date range at a time. So you can't have ROI date ranges that overlap. Just a note about where to find the ROIs. This is the King County HMIS page. When you click on forms and guides, down here at the bottom are the client forms. This is the release of information. This is revocation of consent, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then there is a recently updated ROI frequently asked questions.
And we highly recommend that you check out the frequently asked questions because so many of these questions are common, different kinds of scenarios. And so we try to cover them all so that you have the information.
Sure. We have a question from.
We have a couple from our virtual audience. So one question is, does CEA, so Coordinated Entry for All, collect ROIs as part of their process, or does that only fall on the enrolling programs?
Actually, that's a good question.
Go for
I'll
it.
speak here.
Go for it.
So for somebody to get a referral to the community queue, they're getting assessed. An assessor, in order to enter the VI SPDAT or process in HMIS, is getting an ROI signed if they don't have one already. If they're creating a new profile, they're trained to get that signed. We teach them the training. Danielle, I'm looking to you because you've been doing some of the trainings. They're also taught, those assessors, to look first. They don't have to do another one if there's somebody already has a profile in there. So CEA, through the assessors, are getting ROIs when they're creating new profiles, which they need to do in order to save and refer to the queue. Hopefully that answers that question. Is there anything else from?
No.
Okay.
That sounds great.
And then another question here, somebody is saying, I have had instances where guests have been non-consent guests with incorrect information on their form. How do you track the difference with the system when they don't consent to personal identifying info? So I'm not sure, and the person who posted this may have a clarification, but sometimes we do have folks, and this is covered in the FAQ, we have people who say, the person in front of me, the client is telling me they don't consent, but I'm seeing that there is identifying information in the system. So I guess that is the time, if you have somebody who you're saying is not consenting, you would go through the revocation process, which we're going to cover as part of this presentation. If that is not the scenario, I'm yelling over here and looking over here, then I'll get a clarification.
Okay.
I would also say this gets back to checking first to see if someone is already in there before you're starting the process again, because I know myself, if I've done something multiple times and somebody asks me again, I'm going to just sort of say the heck with it and not want to do with it and not want to deal with it. So check first. If it's already there and done, move on, because sometimes just being asked the fourth or fifth time can be the trigger.
So you spoke about expiration dates, and we can't have multiple pay agreements. So what is procedure in making sure that the RR is reviewed, that we're not, the information is not there legally, but we have consent for the clients to have that.
So the question, just repeating is what do you do if you have a new ROI that falls within an existing date range?
So the RI is expiring, so the next
Yeah.
in 30 days, do we have to do it then, or within, like right now, we do a new RI and have that conflict time frame?
I'm looking to Sarah for the answer for that.
So would the new one be replaced?
Yeah, you can do a new one. I'm just wondering if it's dated before the actual start date that you put in the system, if that's a problem. Right.
So if you made the old one expire sooner and then dated the new one for whatever day that it was actually signed.
Right, that's
I'm
true.
pretty sure the object of it actually protects and will let you know. It supersedes the oldest or to the farthest out date ROI. So it will use a bit of I've done that before where CCS has an ROI uploaded, so I have one that has the longest date. And when I upload mine, it actually and then I found it really cool. Both of them are listed, but only one of them is
So you're saying there will be two releases in there with the start date, and then your newer one will just extend the end
Yeah.
date.
I see. Great.
Great.
The wisdom in the room.
I'm looking to see see if we have any questions. We had somebody somebody clarified and said, Kelly here said, someone may not be consenting but giving false identifying info. We haven't had that one come up before. It's not in our FAQ. And I would say that if somebody is not giving what you know to be their accurate identifying information, then I would treat them as a non-consent. We don't have false identities in the system. So I don't know if that's covering the situation here. I'll see if there's more. We did not, it was hard to hear about the overlapping ROI. So can we get a summary of what you guys were just also talking about, the overlapping ROI?
Sure. So with the overlapping ROIs, the recommendation was to have both of them in there, keep the original start date for the oldest ROI, and then when you have a new ROI, just extend the end date. So it's one very long, over 7-year period because you have those two releases. Okay, a couple special cases with ROIs that we wanted to note. In the cases of families, so if you're doing the electronic signature for families, for each of the children's profiles, you'll need to open up that child, have the parent or guardian sign. So it'll show up with the parent, when you go to print it off, it'll show up with the parent or guardian signature and then the child's name. Parent or guardians can sign for minors. Clients cannot sign for spouses, significant others, children over 18. I would say if they have legal guardianship, then yeah. So the question was, can someone still sign for an adult if they have guardianship? And the answer is yes. If they have legal guardianship, they can sign for the adult child or spouse.
Or power of attorney.
Or power of attorney. Yeah. Other special cases are veterans. So if you're working with a veteran who has signed a VA ROI, if you do the paper HMIS consent, continue to scan them together and upload them as one document. If you have them sign the electronic consent, the VA ROI can be uploaded here under files. So you'll have 2 ROI locations, but that's only if they sign electronic consent.
And this is because for those in the veterans program, in order to be able to access those programs, there's an additional
Yes.
ROI.
Yeah.
So if I got a family out of a kid, I need a ROI certificate.
Yes. The question was, if you have a household with children, do you need HMIS consent for all of the children as well? And the answer is yes. If they are identified in the system, they need HMIS consent uploaded, signed and uploaded. Yes.
Is a separate VA ROI apply only to VA programs? Like say we're an overnight shelter. You need to get 2 ROIs if somebody's a veteran?
I think it applies specifically to veteran programs, so not necessarily the VA, but programs like SSVF, other veteran-specific programs. I would say the veteran release would be, so the question was, if you have a veteran who has dependent children, do you need to get the VA ROI for the children as well? And I think it would depend on what you were communicating with the VA about.
Yeah, because like my children.
Then I would say that the VA may request it.
We can get, that is, what the VA ROI covers is a little bit beyond our scope, so we can find out and get back to you.
Yeah, and we'll refine that question. We haven't had that one before.
Yeah.
But we'll refine it on the FAQ.
Great. And then, so one quick thing add on to that is creating a de-identified client. which I'm going to run through really quickly. So to add a client, search, add a client.
So this is when your client does not consent to
Oh,
have
yes.
their identifying information in HMIS. You create a de-identified profile, their enrollments and all that information, and the information attached to their enrollment is still tracked in HMIS, but we just, those personally identifying pieces of information, we have to de-identify them in order to share information in the system.
Yes.
So that's what.
And there's a difference between creating a de-identified profile and de-identifying an existing profile. Do we talk about that later, or should I talk about that now?
I think we have a slide that mentioned, we do talk about it.
Okay.
Yes, yes.
All right. So this is if a client comes to you and is like, I don't want my information in the system, I'm not giving consent. So social security number is client refused. Last name should be refused.
And social security number is all zeros. That's what triggers the system to know that the client is de-identified.
Yes. Quality of name is client refused. Date of birth is client refused.
And all these sorts of details are in the basic training and in.
Yes. Yes. These demographics, you can collect and enter the actual data for. You create an identified client. Make sure that you still go to that client to the Privacy Shield, add a release of information where it says permission, change it to no, and then just add the record. That way it'll still show up as a de-identified client, and it will show that the consent was declined.
Can you show them what they need to do with the name? And
Oh,
the
yes.
identifier?
And again, we're going through this very quickly. This is not intended as a full-on training about this, but just sort of to kind of point out the basic points that hopefully you've seen before, but also can follow up on later.
And these steps are in the user manual and they're on the HMIS website.
And of course, when you're adding a date of birth for a de-identified client, you 1/1 for the month and day, and then a year within 3 years of the actual date of birth, years or more. And you want to be conscious of the fact that you're serving populations whose age may impact their eligibility for services, that you think about that when entering that date of birth. You don't want to age them out of services if they're a young adult, or make them too young for services if they're somebody who would qualify for services for somebody over 65.
So when you initially create the client, you want to make the first name, and this should actually be consent. Make the first name consent, the last name refused. As soon as you create that profile, this unique identifier is created. Copy this unique identifier, make it the client's first name, and save changes. That way you don't have all like 15 different clients with the name consent refused. Also, if you have any internal agency tracking ID numbers, you can add those in the alias field as well, so that you can keep track of your consent refused clients. A question here?
It says client.
Yeah, that was an error on my part. Yeah, yes.
Now, I'm relatively sure that the last time I was uploading information, client information, and there was a refusal regarding the social security number, that I did the all zeros, and it's relatively sure that because I did that, I couldn't get it to work.
That should. Oh,
Yeah, so the question was, an individual encountered a challenge when they entered all zeros, a challenge with creating the profile from that point.
And that shouldn't be the case. This is standard. This is how folks enter de-identified clients. So if you encounter that again, I would contact our help desk, and they can help you troubleshoot what's actually going on.
Okay, now that I think more into it, 2 days ago, so I might remember it was, I may have actually.
Oh,
Yeah.
So, I'll make a really.
Right, the system does try to guide you to not putting in just fake IDs, you know, like all ones. It'll tell you that that doesn't look like a valid, but it will accept all zeros because that's how we.
Okay, questions?
If someone is non-consent in HMIS, then should the VA ROI also not be uploaded?
Correct.
Yeah, we don't want any identifying documents uploaded for a non-consenting client. Somebody noted that for gender, race, and everything, you said data not collected versus client refused. And then somebody else chimed in that actually you could.
Yes.
So can you speak to both of those?
Yes. So I did data not collected just for ease of creating a client on the spot in the training without having to think about things. So for gender, race, ethnicity, and vet status, those are not considered protected information, so you can enter those accurately.
And if your client still refuses to, does not want that information, there's a safety reason not to, then client refused
Yes.
would be the answer.
Yes.
That was the question here.
Yeah. So data not collected was just what I used for the training, not an example that you should follow.
I think that's all for our question here. Oh, there was the question about, does the agency keep a physical copy of non-consenting ROIs?
That is a great question. Yes. And I believe the case manager signs it or just puts their name on it and puts it in the file.
Sign in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Initial it, yeah.
So if a client does not consent, still put a release of information in your file that indicates non-consent.
And did you show how to document non-consent in the system
Yes.
also? Okay.
Yes.
Should we be collecting kids' social security numbers?
The question was, should you be collecting social security numbers from minors?
I don't know that, I mean, many agencies do collect them from minors. Certainly there are plenty of children who have social security numbers in the system. If your agency has a policy against that, then, you know, just be aware that that may result in duplicates for kids in the system. Other agencies may indeed collect that information if you're also working with a family, so you may still see kids' social security numbers in the system.
Any additional questions? Okay. So we talked a little bit about if a client is a brand new client, has not been in the system before, how to enter them as a de-identified client. If a client comes to you and is revoking consent, always, always, always reach out to our help desk instead of changing the names yourselves, because there are names that are kind of in hidden places that might get missed. So we want to make sure that if a client becomes de-identified, that their name in all of the potential places is removed. Clients.
Additionally, clients may be working with multiple agencies, and our help desk will do their best to reach out to other agencies to let them know that a client is being de-identified, so that they don't lose track of that client when suddenly they can no longer find them by their name.
If a client is revoking consent, there is a revocation of consent form. This form is not needed for clients who are actively fleeing DV, but may be requested from our help desk for clients who are revoking in other circumstances. And that can be found on the web page that I showed earlier, the King County HMIS page.
But we do have to have that revocation of consent form before the help desk will de-identify a client if it's a situation where it is required. Just like clients are required to sign to give consent, they're required to sign to revoke that consent as well.
Another question here.
Sure.
Two things. One, we've been referencing the user manual, and Anne from YWCA is pointing out that there might be a discrepancy in what's in the user manual for the documenting of the no behind the security shield, and we're in the process of updating that manual. So Definitely read the FAQ on the website, which we've referenced many times in every training that we talk about ROI stuff. That was just updated. So, and that talks about everything that Danielle has just gone over. But we are in the process of making some edits to the user manual, and we'll pay close attention to making sure that every step obviously matches what is here. This is not new, but as you can imagine, a new system over 2 years takes a while for all steps to catch up. There's a question about, can you clarify your position on what to do if you get an ROI for some members of the family, but not all the members? Or when you're working with an existing profile where this is the case, can some clients in a family be de-identified and others identified?
Yes. The answer to that is yes. If there is safety concerns or some of the special circumstances that we're about to talk about, the answer is a little bit different. But if a client just does not want their identifying information in the system, and that's all there is to it, there's no safety concern, then yes, some members can be de-identified and other members can be identified.
Okay, Stacey? No? Okay. Is this still me?
No.
Okay.
Okay. So now we're going to talk about some of these more complicated scenarios and some of the scenarios where there are legal requirements around consent or non-consent. So the first one, which is the one we probably get the most questions around, is domestic violence. So there are essentially two different realms of consent with regard to folks who are dealing with domestic violence situations. So the first one is for agencies that are victim service providers, and if you are, you know that you are. In that case, clients exist in sort of their own separate silos for each of those agencies. All clients for victim service providers are de-identified. They have one profile per agency that they seek services with, and there's no overlap between those profiles. And those profiles are never merged. Even if you work for a victim service provider and you know you have a client in common with another victim service provider, you would never seek to merge those profiles. They always stay completely separate so that they can never be identified and tied back to any particular client. The situation that's a little less black and white is for agencies who are serving those who are actively fleeing. Now, we underline actively fleeing because we want to make sure that it's clear that this is just for folks who have a safety concern around fleeing domestic violence, not necessarily somebody who has experienced domestic violence at some point in their life and is not facing an active safety concern, but this is really for folks who are just actively leaving a situation and could be in danger as a result. The answer to whether their information is identified or not in the system is not cut and dried. It's a matter of the client's determination of their own safety. So it's best to evaluate the client's safety with them, and then they can decide whether they feel safe having their identifying information in the system or not. If they do not, of course, it is no problem at all to de-identify them or to contact the BitFocus help desk to have them de-identified. They don't need to do the revocation of consent process because it is a safety concern. And if you're in doubt, if you're unsure whether they should be identified or not, it's also fine to de-identify them in the interest of making sure that they are safe. But it's not by default that they have to be de-identified. If they feel like they would rather have their identifying information in the system because of other services that they're connected with, or because they know that there's no chance that their abuser could get access to the system, then that's really up to them. And along with that, if they want to use their unique identifier to share with other agencies so that if they do have a de-identified profile, but they also want to make sure that they are still connected to services, or maybe they are they're on the community queue and they don't want to lose that, they don't want to miss out on any opportunities because now their profile is de-identified, they can use their unique identifier at other agencies and have still one shared profile even though it's de-identified. So any questions about domestic violence before we move on?
Not yet.
Okay, great. All right. The next one is for clients who have HIV, who are HIV positive or who have AIDS. So this one is also a little bit complicated. So just because clients are HIV positive does not mean that they need to be de-identified in the system. They only need to be de-identified if you're going to be documenting that HIV positive status in HMIS. We don't want to tie it back to them, to their identifying information. But if that information is not going in the system, then they don't actually need to be de-identified unless, of course, they choose to be de-identified, like any client can choose that. It used to be that every program enrollment collected HIV status. We have removed that question for all programs except those that are receive funding through HOPWA. That's the only program that actually requires that we ask that question. So now you shouldn't even have an opportunity to document that information in the system. So you shouldn't need to worry about disclosing it in the system such that you're then required to de-identify clients. Again, you can de-identify clients, but you only are required to do so if you're documenting their HIV status and they have a protected HIV status in the system. And so again, they can share their unique ID. If they are de-identified, they can share their unique ID with other agencies so that they can keep one profile throughout the system to avoid duplicates. And I forgot to mention, but if you're an agency that uses scan cards, then that's even easier because the scan card has their unique identifier regardless of whether they're identified in the system or not. So you can take that to they can take that to other agencies and be connected to their profile easily that way. Any questions about protected HIV status? All right. That slide was supposed to be deleted. Sorry. Unaccompanied minors are the last sort of special situation. So only adults are legally able to consent to have their identifying information in HMIS, which means that if you serve unaccompanied minors, they must be de-identified in the system. And of course, minors are anybody under 18. But again, clients can share their unique identifier with other agencies. You can give them that identifier, or maybe again, if you're using scan cards, they can take that identifier to other agencies. They can have one shared profile in the system, but that profile cannot be identified or cannot contain identifying information. Yeah. That's a good question. The question is, what if a client is emancipated? I guess in that case, does anybody? They're technically, okay. Okay, yeah. So the room agrees that if they are emancipated, that yes, they can, since they have adult status, they can consent for themselves. All right. So we talked about this a little bit before. We're going to talk a little bit about approaching the ROI, what you might see in the system, and how to handle different kinds of scenarios with regard to whether or not an ROI may or may not exist. So as we mentioned, if possible, if at all possible, check a client's ROI status before you meet with them, if you have the opportunity to do so. That can resolve a lot of questions right off the bat. You can see that they maybe already have an ROI in HMIS, and if that's the case, then nothing more is needed. You don't need to have the conversation with them. You can just move on to the actual work that you want to do with them.
And then sort of tag on with that. When you look in the client profile, make sure that the actual ROI is there, not just that the profile exists. So make sure that you go in and check that the ROI has been uploaded.
Right, so Danielle just clarified that you're not making sure that the profile exists, you're actually looking to make sure that there is an ROI in the system, which you can do under that little green privacy shield on a client's profile. So if there is no ROI on file, then you need to get one on file, which you can do in a variety of different ways. If your agency has a history of serving this client, then you may already have an ROI signed for this client. You may have a current one under our current HMIS, or maybe you have an old Safe Harbors one. Either way, grab that ROI and upload it into the system, and the ROI issue is done. Again, you don't have to have the conversation with clients. The ROI is taken care of. If you don't have an ROI, if the client is new to you, but you can see in their history that they've been served by other agencies, then those agencies should have an ROI on file for the client that hasn't yet been uploaded. So you can reach out to them to get the ROI. And again, not have the conversation with clients, but just get that ROI uploaded into the system. You can ask them to upload it. You can ask them to get it to you so you can upload it. Either way is fine. And then, of course, if those aren't options, then hopefully you can have a conversation with your client about consenting to having their identifying information in HMIS. Again, electronic signatures make this process much easier. If they have identifying information in HMIS already, you can frame the conversation that, you know, we see here that you have consented to have your information in the past. But we just need to, you know, have you sign this document to confirm that we see that I know that it's missing, or, you know, something, it looks like another agency didn't add it to the system, whatever the case may be. Can I just get your signature here, and here's the form? That way, you know, you don't have to worry. You don't have to kind of start the conversation from scratch, because they've already been through it with some other agency and did give consent, because otherwise their identifying information wouldn't be in the system. But this way, it might be a way to just kind of ease the conversation along quickly, get the signature, and then just move on to actual services. So then this is a question that comes up all the time. What if my client has an ROI in HMIS, but they say that they don't consent? So in that case, really, like, as we talked about, they have to go through the revocation of consent process, which means completing the form, and then, you know, you would contact the help desk. It's also the opportunity for you to have a conversation with your clients about why they're not consenting. Sometimes clients have concerns about the kind of information that's being tracked in the system. You know, you can actually show them their client information screen so that they can see that information. Sometimes it's reassuring to see that it's actually not a huge amount of information and that the scope is pretty limited. And also, you know, talk with them about, of course, what their concern is, why they're no longer consenting, and see if you can allay that concern. You know, if there's a reason that they're not consenting that you can address. All right, coordinated entry and non-consent. So, of course, the most important thing when you have a client who is on the community queue awaiting a housing referral is that you want the coordinated entry folks to be able to contact your client. If they have no identifying information in the system, that makes it extremely difficult, in fact, impossible for them to contact your client. So if you have a new client who you are serving and you are referring to them to the community queue for the first time, maybe you're an assessor, you've assessed them and you're referring them to the community queue, you must fax your client's contact information to Coordinated Entry for All so that they have that contact information, since they won't be able to get it in the system because your client is de-identified. So that's a very key step. If you are serving a client who's on the queue and they are revoking consent, this is another reason why it's super important to contact the help desk if your client is revoking consent, because the help desk will work with you to make sure that the coordinated entry folks get your client's contact information so that they can still be reached when a housing opportunity becomes available for them. Any questions?
No, I would chime in and just say it's always good practice to check the history tab of your client that you're working with, because then you can see whether they're on the community queue and awaiting a housing opportunity. And so you'll be prepared to then go to the CEA website. They have a provider manual. They have this all outlined in their information as well.
And if in doubt, really, if you're dealing with this whole consent issue and you're just not sure, this is all a big jumble in your head and there's so many different options and you're not sure, just contact the BitFocus help desk. They will help you navigate the process and figure out what steps need to happen and when and with who, and make sure the right people are contacted and get it all taken care of. So always, if in doubt, the help desk is your friend.
Has anybody had to do a revocation and contact the help desk for de-identification in this room? I'm just curious. It comes up quite a bit, so I'm just curious. No questions here? No questions yet? You want to man this?
Yeah.
Okay. So, and folks who are online, please, if you're not getting your questions answered, type those in and we'll get those answered. So this training, you know, we address this topic a lot in all the trainings we do, but we wanted to have a dedicated training to this because it came up as a suggestion from you guys, from the agencies, when we were asking what trainings for 2018. And we've started reviewing the data. We started now looking to see, are agencies documenting consent in the system when they're creating new profiles? Because we migrated all these profiles that had consent documented in a different way. And so we know that agencies are starting to work with all those, but then agencies are creating new profiles in the system. And there should be no reason why consent isn't documented for those new profiles. Because they're brand new, you know, you're working with them brand new. We've been having these trainings, newsletter articles, user manual. There's a variety of resources. So we're going to start doing data quality outreach with the agencies now that we've come to this point. You are used to us reaching out to the agencies, and those of you who are HMIS agency leads for your agency are very familiar with our team reaching out. If you're not in that role, your agency has that role because somebody had to be identified as that person for your agency when your agency signed the memorandum of agreement to be a participating agency in HMIS. So there's somebody at your agency who we will be reaching out to and saying, great, every single one of the profiles that your staff have created has had their consent documented. Or we'll be saying, hey, can you have your staff look at these? Because we're noticing that these profiles are being created and their status is not documented behind the security shield. We're going to start that starting in March, sort of on the heels of this training. There's no canned report that you can run yourselves, which is why you'll get the outreach from us. And we'll start by looking at the most recent and working our way backwards. Like if your agency is creating profiles this month, let's see why, you know, what can we put in place to support your agency to make sure that we're documenting consent as it should be documented, because you're all sharing that profile. So you all want to be assured that all the steps are being processed correctly. So we're going to be looking at, like I said, those ones that are not documenting ROI status for new clients, especially for identified clients, you know, that will be sort of how we triage, is identifying information in there without yes consent and everything uploaded. And then we'll look at de-identified, that no should be in there. We just want to make sure all the steps are followed, and then migrated records. So we'll sort of triage back, and we'll be doing a lot of outreach to your agencies. And it'll be ongoing. It's sort of a nonstop outreach, and you'll get the same, you know, you get the same outreach when we're looking at reporting for other data quality issues. So this will just be one of those. Just as a reminder, there's lots of ways to get that consent documented. You can, if you're working with somebody who you know that profile was migrated over from the old safe harbors, you can scan and upload that safe harbors for those that have been migrated. For any profile that has been created since April 2016, the HMIS ROI that was agreed upon and approved for this system should be the one that gets signed and uploaded, and that is on our website. We have already gotten permission that the signature page alone is fine to scan and upload. So it's a 2-page document. We know that makes it a pain sometimes for the scanning process. You can just scan and upload the signature page. If you have a process that is safe and secure in your agency and your agency approves it, you can take a photo and upload that. And don't forget that now we've been approved for electronic signatures, so that you can, what Danielle and Sarah were talking about before, you can get that signed electronically. The software has a feature that would allow us to make it impossible for you to move forward with any step without getting an ROI uploaded. But the agreement was to not turn that feature on early on because of all this migrated data, and we have the safe harbors process, which did not allow for an uploaded consent status in the system. So that's why we're doing training and support and then outreach as a way to ensure compliance at this stage, because we're not turning on the hard stop on the software that would make it impossible for you to move forward without getting that.
Do you have plans to turn that on? And if so,
Right now there are no plans, so there's no timeline attached to that. It's my dream as a data person. Data people don't like having to go back and ask for data. So yes, but of course, you know, as sort of somebody who also supports agencies, that would make it hard to get your work done sometimes if you had to run back and scan. And that was, you know, especially when we didn't have electronic signatures, that would be a burden on agencies because, you know, people don't have scanners at their desks. No. Are there any questions there? We're ahead of schedule, which is good. Are there any questions about this process?
So you talked about like compliance, like you have a timeline of like when you want to see like percentage of like being compliant?
That is a very good question. And we, oh, sorry, thank you. So the question is, in terms of compliance, do we have a timeline of when we want to see a certain percentage in compliance? I would say for 2018 client profiles, the expectation is 100%. We've been talking about this now for almost 2 years, and through a variety of newsletter articles and trainings and everything. So for 2018, which is what we're 2 months into it, I think that will be the first outreach that we do, and the expectation will be a short timeline and 100% compliance. And then we'll have to look at the data and what the burden is for the agency to start whittling away at what the expectation is. I think being responsive to us goes a long way, because then we know that you're working on it, and then if we can sort of see progress, then that's great.
And I think overall, that's the approach we would like to take, because we've all been operating, understanding one another's good faith and believing that there are those signed ROIs that we don't see, but we know we need to start having them in the system. And so if we see positive movement forward and we're at 100% for 2018 and things are looking better and better for the still active clients, then we won't have to come to we would hope not to have to come to the kind of hard stop, although we will if necessary, but that's down the road.
So basically, we're talking about active clients. We're not talking about going back to, say, 2015 and uploading ROIs for an inactive client. Is that what we're talking about, or is that the eventual goal?
Well, correct. I mean, we only migrated. Yeah, sorry. So the question is, would we be going back to inactive clients? And the example was, the year given was 2015. Kate just said active clients are the priority. You know, and then I guess if we get that covered, if there is a reason that we determine with the county, it's not my decision, right, that we need to go back, especially for identifying information, and just confirm that there was, you know, that somebody is tracking consent, then we would start whittling away at that.
Right, because we work with emergency offset shelters down at County and City Hall. So we probably have 6,000 clients coming back to that number.
Right, of course.
And only 500 or about 1,500 active clients.
So you should be done with all that by next week.
Yeah. Absolutely, absolutely. And we're aware of that, and that was also one of the things where we knew it was harder when agencies had to scan and they couldn't do electronic signatures. So, you know, we're aware, and you sort of see the patterns. You're like, oh, that's high volume emergency shelter. You know, you sort of see the patterns in the data depending on who the provider is, for sure.
For me, it would be easier if I don't see the consent in there, to scan and put it in there. Is that okay?
So the question is it okay to go ahead and get it signed and scanned and uploaded? And are you talking about if they have identifying information already in there? Yes. I mean, I'm looking to you, Kate, because I know that our ideal is to not make clients continue to sign consent and get it uploaded. But if the client is consenting and they're willing to work with the provider, we've often said, go ahead and get it up in there.
For like the clients, because I already been having them sign. So moving forward, I'm gonna go check and see if there's a consent in there. But for the ones that already signed, then if I don't see a consent uploaded, can
Upload
yeah.
yours.
Yes.
Yeah, great. Are there other questions? Any other questions in there?
Sarah's just there checking her personal email.
Yeah,
No, just a few that we've already.
you
covered
could
the
answer
answers
that we've
to, yeah.
covered. Okay. Kate, is there anything else from the county that you want to make sure we cover?
No, I mean, I think we all know that we're all trying to work on this initiative and it's for the benefit of participants, that we're all really sharing transparently that we know we have their release of information to do so. And to the extent that we can have identified information, it really does help people access other resources. So hopefully we can just, as we make the process easier, we'll be able to collectively have that information.
Yeah, great. Well, we'll upload, I kept track of the additional topics that came up today that we can add to the FAQ. So as soon as we we'll continue to update that version that is online. So definitely, if you and your colleagues have questions, that is a good first resource, is that FAQ on the website. Great, so we have some more trainings coming up this afternoon. If any of your colleagues couldn't make this one, we'll be hosting our monthly office hours. So very informal, I'll be there, online only, and we can do a demo, we can talk about ROI some more, go through the whole process of enrolling. It's like a little HMIS 101 for folks who need it, and answer any questions that you have or anybody else in your agency. We have next month, tentatively, we'll be focusing on coordinated entry for the topical training. We don't know yet, so it may be a different topic or we may be postponed, but because we want to do that in partnership with coordinated entry for all. So keep an eye out on your email for the newsletter announcements or training specific announcements. We've recorded this one. Again, if you're subscribing to our very popular YouTube channel, you'll see all the recorded trainings up there. And so we'll send out a link to this training and the slides afterwards, like we usually do. And we appreciate your feedback. Any feedback that you give us about trainings that you need throughout the year is helpful for us, because we'll continue to evolve the training schedule over time. Anything else? Great. Thank you, everybody, for your time.